Thanks, Yasmin. And thanks everyone for the opportunity to come here and speak to you today about a dairy perspective on these free trade agreements and how we engage through the dairy industry, through Dairy Australia and our representative groups, and our companies in terms of this broader trade agenda, which has been quite unprecedented really in the last 12 to 18 months in terms of the types of developments that we've seen in this space. But before getting into it, I mean, at the heart of it, it's like, well, why are we investing so much time, energy and resources into this area from a dairy industry perspective? And when you strip it all back, it's about getting a fair price for our product. And for the farmers, our dairy farmers, our levy payers who are saying we are exporting about $3 billion worth of dairy product each year. Of that, over $250 million gets siphoned away to overseas governments through tariffs. So that's dead money. That's money that should be going into our pockets, into the pockets of our supply chain to give us a fair price for our product. Now there's a whole heap of dynamics that are involved in the competitive positioning and how do we sit, that spaghetti bowl effect that that Tony talked about where do we sit in relation to our competitors. But when you strip it all back, it's about getting a fair price for our product on those international markets on which we depend. And when you're talking about dairy, we're exporting about 40% of our total production. So our prices are very much determined by the international market price. And therefore, when it comes to that getting a free and open market, which isn't being convoluted by all those tariffs that, as I said, go to overseas governments, that's ultimately a good thing for dairy producers and exporters. So if we start looking at the last 12 to 18 months, as I said, it's been an unprecedented time in this whole trade space. We start off with the Korean Free Trade Agreement, which from a dairy perspective is as good as a standalone agreement in terms of opening up a lot of new market access, particularly for cheese. But we were still lagged behind some of our competitors, particularly the United States and the European Union, in that market, and so that it was a bit of a mixed bag, but still ultimately leading to freer trade environment, which was good. We moved into later in the year with the Japan Economic Partnership Agreement or Free Trade Agreement. And it's fair to say from a dairy industry perspective, this was a pretty poor deal and a bit of a wake-up call for the industry. We didn't get a fully liberalising agreement. Japan is quite an unusual market from the perspective that it is so highly protectionist about its agricultural community and dairy farmers in particular. But ultimately we got some marginal gains, and so from a dairy industry perspective, not a positive deal. And then that moved into the end of the year, and that was the China Free Trade Agreement, which we like to refer to as the dairy deal. We're very happy about that deal, and ultimately for the Australian dairy industry, a really transformational outcome for us. And I'll go through a bit about these deals in more detail and some of the importance and why we've invested in our time in those, but also give you a bit of an outline about some of the broader dynamics about how they've changed and how the way that industries engage in these free trade agreements and has done so over the last 12 to 18 months as a result of some of the changing dynamics at a political level. And then talk about, well, once we get these things over the line, then where to from here in the trade liberalisation agenda? Is it just about the FTAs, or is there other things involved in making sure we get that fair price for our farmers? But in starting, if you look at, I'm not sure if you can see this very clearly, but just talking about that $3 billion of Australian dairy exports, where does it go? And you can see from this chart here that the majority of the value is being generated through those Asian markets. Our focus as an industry has been very much on China, Japan, Southeast Asia and Middle East. China, to Brett's point, I mean, if you include the Greater China, Hong Kong and Macau, China as of last year became our #1 export market. You compare that to 1990, it was our 19th largest market. We've had about a 60% increase in dairy exports even over the last sort of 5 to 7 years in that market. It's been an enormous growth, and we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Japan, it's a market that we've dominated in for many years. We've got about 45% market share of the cheese market in that market. and so a very important market, but it's not growing, and we can talk a bit about that in a moment. Southeast Asia, about 30% of our exports, quite significant growth and a big focus. The Middle East, as I said, about 11-12% of our exports going into the Middle Eastern markets. But you can see there that this chart would have been very, very different than it would have been, say, 30 years ago, when you would have seen a lot more focus on Europe, a lot more focus on the United States and North America. So it's very much our focus has shifted back into that Asian region, which means the last 12 to 18 months, when we're talking about deals with these countries like Korea, Japan and China, has been such an enormously significant time for the dairy industry. So if we look at, start off with China, because I mean there was, as I said, the dairy deal. Why is so much focus and attention, and I hope you saw a lot of that enthusiasm that came out of the dairy industry on the announcement of that deal, and why is that actually the case? I mean, ultimately it's about China becoming the largest and fastest growing dairy market in the world. 1.3 billion people. We all know the stats. The stats are overwhelming. 16 million babies born each year. That's a lot of infant formula. And our guys have seen that. They've seen that opportunity, and that's what they're really trying to tap into. On the back of, they're importing about 10 to 15 billion litres worth in raw milk equivalent dairy imports each year, and we only produce 9.5 billion litres in total, of which we consume about 60%. So the scale of the market opportunity is enormous. And on the back of some of the trust issues that their local consumers have been facing. You would have heard about the melamine incident, or the contamination issue back in about 2008. About 6 babies died as a result of that through contamination in the Chinese market from dairy products. That bred a real distrust of local product at that time, and really drew sort of more demand for clean, green and safe producers like those of Australia, and we've really been able to capitalise on that opportunity. Their consumption still at about 33 kilograms per head per capita. Compare that to Australia with over 300. So a huge amount of opportunity there, and you can see in that chart over the last 5-6 years the kind of growth that we've seen in total Chinese dairy imports, which has just been quite a remarkable story. So therefore that you can understand why there's been the amazing enthusiasm over trying to open up the marketplace. But we've also, when we talk about China, there's the other dynamic here about looking at what New Zealand did in an equivalent time. And if you talk about, they finalised their free trade agreement back in 2008. And you only have to look at the market shares of tapping into that Chinese market between 2007, prior to them getting their free trade agreement done with China, and what emerged when you move 6 years later, back to 2013. And we had a total market at the time that was about 500 million litres going to this total dairy going to the Chinese market, of which the New Zealand dairy industry had about a 20% market share. Move forward 6 years, suddenly the total market in China is over 2 million litres, 2 billion litres, or 2 million tonnes, I should say, and New Zealand having about a 40% market share. So they doubled their market share on a market that quadrupled. That's an 8-fold increase in their total exports going into that Chinese market. That obviously, when it comes to their free trade agreement, that was a huge advantage for them. It wasn't the only factor that has enabled them to capitalise on that opportunity. We've seen a massive amount of transformational change in the New Zealand dairy industry in that time anyway, which has given them some real market opportunities into markets like China. But undoubtedly, the free trade agreement helped as they moved towards total duty-free access and position them as a supplier of choice to tap into that market opportunity. So that's what our industry saw. They saw this huge market building and growing and developing, and New Zealand capitalising more than anyone else in terms of capitalising on that market opportunity, helped by the fact that they had this free trade agreement in place, and they're saying we want some of that. We have to make sure that the Australian dairy industry, through our free trade agreement, is forefront and centre in that agreement. So at the end of the day, we did our deal. That's been signed. It hasn't been ratified yet. That's still got to go through a political process. which we hope will unfold over throughout the course of this year. But what is it actually worth at the end of the day? What's it worth in monetary terms? We're currently paying about $60 million of tariff revenue into that market. So in total implementation of that deal, which all those tariffs will be phased out between 4 and 11 years, that will be worth $60 million in terms of the tariffs we're paying today. But that's assuming we don't have any more growth in that market. So we've already seen about 11% per annum growth over the last 5 years into the Chinese market. If we continue to grow at about 10% over the next 10 or so years, it's worth about $170 million a year for us in monetary terms. So it's not insignificant. If you really break it down into the actual numbers, and that will put us on a much more competitive playing field. But as we always say, it is not just about the actual monetary value of these deals. It's also about some of the more intangible benefits that emerge from getting a really good deal like we got out of China. So it's not just about the tariff savings, it's also about our competitive positioning in the world's largest and fastest growing market. It's also about making sure that we're deepening those existing relationships. As I said, even without a free trade agreement, it's still our largest market. But it enables us to deepen those existing commercial relationships. So our companies who have active customers in that market, they can now say, listen, we can build on that relationship. We're already seeing a lot of movement in that space as our companies look to capitalise on their market positioning with this FTA. Signalling Australia as a partner of choice through that, they can source from the Americans, they can source from the Europeans, the New Zealanders and elsewhere, but it's really elevating our profile in that market. And importantly, it was raised earlier about investment and what are the impacts of free trade agreements on investment and inbound investment into industries. We're already seeing it. The deal hasn't even been ratified yet, but we're already seeing, if you look at the press, about investment coming in and investment interest from the Chinese to invest in the Australian dairy industry. It's been overwhelming. We've already seen announcements, Fonterra Australia, with Being Mate, one of the largest infant formula manufacturers, and a joint venture that they've entered into in the Darnham plant down in Victoria. Chongqing Trading Company with Bega Tatura. We've seen Gina Reinhardt with Hope Dairies up in Queensland talking about some infant formula opportunities. New Hope Dairies as well in New South Wales. The list goes on. It's been an amazing turn of events as they've all seen this opportunity. And when we talk about infant formula, there's currently a tariff of 15%. In 4 years, that's going to be gone. And they're going, okay, well, we need it. There's 16 million babies being born each year. It's going to be more competitive if we align with the Australians. And so they're looking at those JV opportunities. And that is where a lot of the inherent value comes from getting these kind of comprehensive deals. Japan, as I said, disappointing from the Australian dairy industry's perspective. Because if you look at this chart, this is really about the cheese export prices into Japan compared to what we currently get from other markets around the world. And if you go back 10 to 15 years, there was a significant price premium that we attained from markets like Japan. The Japanese were seen as finicky, demanding. It took a lot of management and customer service. But you were getting a premium for supplying that. Now they're still demanding, they're still finicky, they're still demanding, you're requiring this customer service, but you can see that there's not the same value or premium in supplying that market. So it was really looked at the Japan Free Trade Agreement as a bit of an opportunity lost to get some of that value back into the market, which ultimately was a bit disappointing. We pay about, of that $250 million or so that we pay in tariffs, we pay about half of that to the Japanese government. Through our exports into Japan. So an opportunity lost, but as I said, it is what it is, and these things can be a bit of a wake-up call at times, and we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. There's also, as Brett mentioned earlier, there's this issue of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's this plurilateral deal across the Asia-Pacific. Japan is also involved in that, so there's further opportunity to hopefully go beyond where we've attained under that Japan Free Trade Agreement to get a better outcome for the Australian dairy industry. And then when we flip across to the Korean Free Trade Agreement, Here, as I said, it all becomes about relativity. So these are country-specific quotas that we have attained through our free trade agreements into the Korea. So a volume amount under which we don't have to pay any tariffs. You can see here that we've got the charts. We've got the United States, European Union, New Zealand and Australia. We've all done free trade agreements with Korea now. You can see that relative to some of those other countries, we're still moving towards duty-free access, but we're not moving there at the same rate that other countries have managed to attain. So as a standalone deal, not bad, but in terms of its relativities to some of our major competitors, we're still a bit behind the 8 ball. But again, you know, when you talk about industries and their motive, their motivations in looking at these kinds of deals now, a lot of that discussion is about how we sit in relation to some of our major competitors. And when we think about our competitors, we're thinking about New Zealand, we're thinking about the United States, and we're thinking about the European Union. So what's changed in the last 12 to 18 months? And I think it's been quite significant, really, if we look at how these things operate and how they're actually negotiated. Brett mentioned before about, you know, traditionally trade has been very bipartisan. You know, we've had all sides of government have recognised the value of trade, our limited domestic population, and the need to open up new market access. That remains the same. But I think it's fair to say that the government has you know, when they came into power in this last election cycle, they recognised that we've got a lot of these trade deals that have been on the agenda for years. You know, if we talk about China, it's been negotiated for many years. Japan, Korea. If we're going to complete some of these deals, at the moment our attitude has been about comprehensive free trade agreements. Everything's on the table or nothing's on the table. Whereas I think it's fair to say the government has taken a bit of a different view and say, well, we can keep on playing that game. But if we continue to play that game, we're probably still going to be negotiating these deals in another 10 years. If we want to conclude these deals, then we're going to have some trade-offs. So it's changed the way, and I think for the dairy industry, the Japan free trade agreement was the wake-up call on that. It was basically saying, well, you know, this deal was about beef industry access. It was about some other things. Dairy, we've given you some, but at the end of the day, to get the deal through, we couldn't give you everything that you needed. And that's just the reality of how it works. So as a result of that, you know, we've seen examples of that across Korea, Japan and China, where you've got commodities that are on the table, you've got commodities that are off the table. You've got a whole raft of trade-offs, and that's just the reality of how it's working now. In 5 or so years ago, you might have looked at it and gone, well, if everything's not on the table, we're not going to do the deal. You might not remember when we did the deal with the United States, our free trade agreement, sugar was left off the table, and there was an almighty outcry about that fact at the time. Whereas if you look at the last couple, there's multitude of examples of that occurring, and that's the reality of how it works. So it's a wake-up call for the dairy industry, particularly after Japan, leading into China. These things have a technical component, which is the role that Dairy Australia plays in providing technical feedback and support into the industry. But there's also a vital political role, and the politics need to stack up for governments in order for them to back industries or commodities depending on who wants it the most. And that's the role that Tony over here plays and the Australian dairy farmers in making sure and reinforcing that the politics line up for governments to back their commodities. And so for the dairy industry perspective, they started an online Twitter campaign, FTA for Dairy. There was numerous examples about dairy farmers getting Minister Rob, the Trade Minister, out to their farm to really embrace and engage with the Australian dairy industry. Prime Minister Abbott went out to various dairy plants. It was very overt that if the deal was going to be done for the dairy industry, there was political capital in doing that. And I have no doubt that as a result of that holistic campaign, that was definitely reinforced the value of getting a very, very good deal for the dairy industry. And we saw that in terms of some of the outcome that that emerged. So different. If you ask me, I think these things have changed, and that's just the reality of the developments in recent times. But a lot of people sort of say, well, we hear about these things in the paper, these trade negotiations. It all seems very esoteric. How does it actually work on the ground from the mechanics of how we engage? And particularly, you're Dairy Australia. You're heavily involved in these things, but then you've got these other agri-political groups, and this chart just is really just to try and highlight how we work through some of this environment. You can see over here you've got all the companies, all the dairy exporters, including the dairy farmers, who come together, and it's our role to really disseminate what are the issues and the interests of the Australian dairy industry collectively. Each of the companies will tell you a different list of priorities, but it's our job to say, well, as the broader industry, what are the areas, what are the priorities that we want to drive as an industry, and then feed that very much into the government, into Brett at the Department of Agriculture, as well as the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who are actively involved at the negotiator level to feed into their counterparts, whether it be in China or Japan or elsewhere. On a parallel track, we'll also feed that information into the agri-political groups, the NFF, the Australian Dairy Industry Council, to make sure that they understand what are the broader industry priorities, but how that also then feeds into the political dynamics. And then that ultimately goes to Minister Rob, the Minister for Trade, who has to make the decision at the end of the day. And as I said, there may be trade-offs. We may be winners, we may be losers, but ultimately the stakes are pretty high. So can the Australian dairy industry capitalise on these FTAs in North Asia and additional FTAs? The question is there, and I think absolutely. But that's not that to say that there aren't still significant hurdles that do remain when we're talking about trade access and the trade agenda more generally. First and foremost, Brett touched on the issue of technical barriers to trade. Every day of the year there are containers of dairy product that are held up on wharves overseas, not because of a tariff issue, but because of a technical barrier to trade. It might be halal certification, it might be product testing regimes, the whole raft of product age restrictions. Some of these legitimate, some of them illegitimate, but either way they cost a lot of money. And I think there's been a real recognition that if we get rid of the tariffs, we've still got a lot of these technical barriers to trade that still stay in the way. So for the Australian dairy industry, we think it costs us about $1.5 billion a year. It's huge. Not just in terms of what it costs us, but also about lost market opportunity, the opportunity cost of that evolves from these technical barriers to trade. So a huge agenda for us as an industry, and as we start to see more freeing up of these markets through these tariff elimination, still reinforcing the need of investing in these technical barriers to trade and the work that we can do through the Department of Agriculture. Secondly, the issue of FTAs by our competitors in the region. As I mentioned, the EU, USA, New Zealand, they've all already got deals with Korea. In China, we've got New Zealand that's come before us, but the Europeans are knocking on the door there. And Japan, there's already talk about this TPP. Where do we sit in relation to New Zealand and the United States, who are also a member of that agreement, as well as the European Union, who are talking about finalising their FTA with Japan later in the year. So while there might be some commercial advantages from our FTAs now, how long will that be retained? Will those competitors jump beyond us in terms of escalating the timeframes for when those tariffs will be removed? And that's another competitive dynamic. And then you've got this issue of competitive dynamics and competitor activity, which is particularly targeting the Asian region. Everyone else is seeing that same. When we talk about dairy and export demand, we're talking about the growth of protein. We're talking about increasing incomes, of which dairy is and the demand for protein, of which dairy is a key component. We're not the only ones seeing that. All our competitors are too, and they're actively targeting our markets, our Asian markets. The New Zealand with the might of Fonterra in New Zealand. Targeting those Asian markets, they're investing behind the borders and they're making great inroads. They've got a very powerful model. That's what we're competing with. The European Union, they've got their production quotas recently came off, which releases one of the big inhibitors for their growth, and obviously they'll be looking towards that Asian region. And then the United States, who traditionally was seen as an opportunistic exporter, they're becoming more and more committed to the export market as their dollar's been relatively low. They're now exporting over 15% of their production compared to 5% maybe 10 years ago. So they're now more committed to the export market, and they're using programs like a domestically funded export subsidy program to capitalise and make sure they're competitive in the region. This is what we're dealing with, so that's not just about the FTAs, it's about being cohesive and coordinated and tapping into those market opportunities. But in saying that, at the end of the day, the FTAs with that framework are so vital to us getting the outcomes. It has been an amazing 12 to 18 months in this space. We've been winners. We haven't been the winners in other deals, but ultimately it's provided a better framework for us. So I hope that gives you a bit of a framework of why we invest our time and resources and energy into this agenda. But it's not the only agenda when we talk about trade. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Charlie. That certainly helped put more perspective on what free trade agreements mean to an industry. So we've got time for a couple of questions. Yes, Peter.
Charlie, Peter Smith from Mark Solomon. Look, it's a question out of ignorance, really, but you said that the Australian consumption of dairy is 301 kilograms a year per capita, which is just over 800 grams per day, and I'm just interested in where it all goes. It just seemed like a remarkably high figure.
It is. I mean, it's one of the highest globally. It's across the board. I mean, we drink a hell of a lot of liquid milk. We've got a fresh milk, pasteurised milk market, and I think in the last decade or so, we've seen the coffee culture has been an enormous drive in dairy. People don't realise when they're having those coffees each day, they're also having a glass of milk. We are a dairy consuming society. We are seeing in the developed world, though, a lot of that per capita dairy consumption coming off.
What about manufactured products?
Yeah, cheese. Yeah, so it's predominantly cheese, but we're more involved in the processed cheese market. But we've also seen a hell of a lot of increasing growth in yogurt consumption in recent times. On top of that, you talk about the MasterChef effect. All these new programs coming out, and suddenly butter, which was a dirty word, is no longer, and people are moving back to butter from margarines or dairy spreads. So we have seen actually a decade that's been quite interesting in the growth in dairy, but we've always been a large dairy consumer. But it's definitely grown in recent times.
I've got a question.
Sorry, Charlie, James here. What's the ramp-up time? If we get more free trade agreements and end up exporting more goods, given that I don't know how much dairy we have left over if we end up needing more stuff, what's the ramp-up in Australia, and where are the opportunities in Australian dairy to actually increase its production?
Sure. A lot of you, I mean, there's no hard and fast answer on this. In terms of the lag times and how industry will respond, we know that with the China FTA, the impetus of positivity that comes in there has come in as a result of that, has been quite significant. And on top of that, the investment interest, which obviously are two of the vital ingredients to spurring on growth. As an industry, where are we going to get to? We know we've been at 11.5 billion litres before. We're currently at 9.5, so we know we've got capacity to grow. And but ultimately it depends on profitability from the farmers as to how far they go. But that's, as I said, the confidence, seeing the investment interest, and these market opportunities undoubtedly will help in that story. But undoubtedly there's more growth opportunity. We're doing a lot of work at Dairy Australia to work out, well, what are the inhibitors to that growth. We're always reluctant to put a line in the sand about what's the exact amount that we can grow to, but I think I mean, we know we've been at around 12 billion litres before as a starting point, and that's let's get to there and see how we're travelling. But what we're saying though is that from a demand perspective, we know the demand is there. We know we're well placed to capitalise on that. But it's a volatile market, and that volatility has been challenging. For dairy producers, and some are electing not to grow, and just hold their existing positioning and based on the fact of what they're comfortable in doing. But I think there's still growth opportunity. But there's no hard and fast answer in terms of how much that's going to be, how fast that's going to be. But we know there's capacity there.